Today's discussion will be how to best deal with Trump's sanctions on Canada. And they are sanctions, they're not tariffs, they are definitely sanctions on Canada. For this discussion, we have two options. One is to follow, like Carney, a slow implementation of counter tariffs or sanctions, or like Rob Ford and other premiers want to do, and that's heavy hitting back against the U.S. And the rationale is that we do have the NAFTA agreement going to be re-evaluated within the year. So what is the best strategy? And that's what we're going to discuss here a bit. So Cal, can you tell us, has there been any counter tariffs implemented by Canada against the U.S. in this battle so far?
Well, that's a good question. There was a list of them that were put out on the Canadian government's website. They range from everything from live animals, poultry, meat and edible products. Again, they're 20, 25% tariffs, fish, a whole raft of products that are not included in the Canadian, US, Mexico trade agreement, which expires next year. The question is, I'm not 100% certain. I can't find whether these are actually being collected or not at
Yeah, there
this
was
time.
a effective date March 4th, 2025 on the United States surtax order 2025-1, but I'm not sure that really, like, it claims that it went into effect, but I'm not sure they're collecting the actual tariff. So we did have the effective date back when we first started and heard that the U.S. was going to implement a 25% tariff. There were countermeasures set up for Kuzma, which I'm just going to refer to as NAFTA because Kuzma is what Trump negotiated, and it is really NAFTA between Mexico, U.S., and Canada. And that comes up to renegotiation in a year. But I haven't heard whether Carney has actually implemented retaliatory measures for the 35% slapped on 15% of the goods going to the U.S. that don't follow compliance with the NAFTA agreement. And one of the issues is a lot of smaller businesses never applied for compliance with NAFTA and just did trade with the U.S. because there was no real need to apply. Now they have to spend money to apply and qualify for NAFTA goods going across to the U.S. And that's putting a big burden on the expenditures and costs to small business, which doesn't seem to be getting assisted by the federal government enough to make these compliance applications. I'm not sure if you've read up on that component.
Well, I don't think the tariffs are necessarily a good idea. Just because somebody does something that is a bad idea to you doesn't mean you should be doing the same thing back. I think what Canada should be doing is putting export duties on what it is that the Americans want. And right now that's oil and gas.
Yes,
So
and
you have to hurt them where they want something. You can't hurt Canadians while you're trying to retaliate against American stupidity.
well,
Why
we have
should
a year to shift the economic engine of Canada, 6 months to a year, because NAFTA is going to be negotiated. So, in shifting the economic engines, that means cutting trade deals with the European markets and UK and France. And I think Carney's already set up these type of deals for international markets. And one of the largest markets coming into play where the economies of many, many countries in Africa are becoming very vibrant. And Africa is a big continent. And China and Russia are really trying to get their foot in there because that's the emerging market of the world. And Canada needs to cut deals with some of these countries for trade agreements too, and that would more than compensate for the 350 million people buying goods from Canada in the US. And that's a slow shift. And we do have time to shift it before there'd be any impacts when Trump tries to hammer us on the NAFTA agreement, putting 35% tariffs on everything. And that's a real possibility that Trump is setting these 35% tariff, indicating that this is what he's going to slap on all deals between Canada and the US, because some stupid person negotiated a bad deal under NAFTA, which we don't want to point fingers, Trump, but you're the one negotiated it. But like you said, there are many goods in Canada that the US really desires, and we don't necessarily look at it as something that US would shoot themselves in the foot, but you got Trump leading the US, and he could very well shoot himself and the US citizens in the foot with his NAFTA agreement, because I do believe it's just retaliatory measures that he wants to impose on countries he feels have wronged him personally in the past. And that boils down to that Trump Towers issue that I keep referring to, that he lost money because his name isn't making him money here in Canada because they were pushed into bankruptcy by the Canadian policies and whatever, and allegations of fraud and investment manipulations and whatever it was that sunk the businesses. And that seems to be his underlying motive, is revenge on any country that he feels has wronged him. In your discussion, what would you see as the best way of imposing oil taxes on the U.S.?
There's certain things that the Americans have to understand, and they know this, that Canada is the largest buyer of American exports. We're their biggest customer. And what they're doing is they're trying to punish us for selling to them. How do we punish them for selling to us? And I think you have to be selective with what you pick. For example, they're short of eggs. So what you do is you put an export duty on eggs. You don't touch oranges because we don't grow oranges in Canada. It doesn't make sense to put a tax to Canadians on oranges, but it would certainly hurt the situation in the U.S. where eggs are selling at 3 or 4 times the historical average. And
so basically, what you're saying is, what we need to do is set up a U.S. export tax and on selective goods, so that
yes,
we collect the money. We collect the money, and if we did that, let's use an example. Let's use your egg, and we put an export tax on an egg. Let's say we said you're going to have to pay 35% export tax on the egg. Now, if we structured that, this is all theory and conjecture, but because nobody's ever had to do this before. But if you set up a export tax and you say, okay, the originating business from Canada has to collect the 35% tax from whatever business is buying it in the U.S. And that allows the businessman here to negotiate with the businessman there as to who's going to pay that 35% tax. So if our government says, okay, if the Canadian business says, okay, they're going to cover the 35% tax as part of a deal, the government should give a rebate scenario to be able to pay back the business for forking out 35%. It's not going to lower the cost of goods into the U.S., so the U.S. businessman has to decide at that point, do you compensate the business in Canada the 35%, or does the business in Canada say, no, you, the U.S., have to pay the 35% before I release the goods at the border to you? And I think that throws a funny scenario into the equation if we did a U.S. mega export tax on goods, because what Trump is claiming is if the goods are higher priced in the U.S., that would justify and stimulate a manufacturing economy in the U.S. because they would be able to manufacture the goods cheaper and supply their own market. But the question I have to ask the viewers is, do you really believe a capitalist would not try to sell the same goods manufactured for the same price as what somebody's supplying from around the world to them is? They're there to make as much profit as possible off the goods. So it's really a fallacy that, you're going to find the ability to manufacture these goods that are coming into the U.S. more economical than the situations that are already in existence. The world economy just didn't happen overnight. It's been there for many decades, and Trump can't reestablish old ideologies of sanctions to justify businesses in the U.S. Businesses want stable investment environments, and when you have a person running around making all sorts of wacky ideas and deals with international countries, that's got to be the most it's got to be the most scary place to invest your money, because you can't trust what tomorrow is going to bring, and you could lose your whole investment bang overnight because some president opens his mouth and shuts off deals that you're negotiating with other countries and markets. So I guess going back to that is, we do need to look at, like you said, imposing some sort of setup to collect the tax here in Canada on the people of the U.S. for goods.
Well, if I can butt in,
Yep.
Obviously there's select items like eggs, cheese, milk, that sort of thing, butter, that we've protected anyways, which caused a lot of issues with the Americans in order to protect the dairy industry, mainly in Quebec and
Supply
Ontario.
management.
Yeah, so there's a lot of issues that we have with them on those issues. We can just impose those tariffs, protect our industries, and there's nothing for them to complain about. The other issue is we are also, Canada, that is, not me in particular, are the biggest investors in the U.S. So the Americans not necessarily rely on Canadian investment, but there's a lot of money that goes from Canada into the U.S., a lot of it via the stock market, where our mega banks and funds are buying U.S. shares and IPO offerings and that sort of thing.
Did
Hundreds of
Carney
million,
buy a
hundred.
whole bunch of?
It's got nothing to do with Carney. What I'm talking about, Corey. But
No. That Carney
thanks.
Carney.
Well, I don't know that, but what I do know
Carney, when
is,
he came into government, bought a bunch of U.S. bonds. So that
how
if
do you
he
know?
well, he did. He bought
No, but how do you know
Canada.
that?
Well, that's what was claimed in the news.
Yeah, but
Carney,
whose news? I don't believe any of that shit.
Carney,
Right?
the Canadian government bought a bunch of bonds and holds a significant amount of bonds in U.S. that if they cashed them out, it would in affect the bond markets in the U.S. And same with Japan, did the same thing. Japan has some of the largest bond positions in the U.S. because that's what funds the U.S. government, is these bonds.
The treasury
And
bills.
yes, the treasury
Okay.
bills, and
Okay.
Canada and Japan are some of the significant holders of these bonds.
Well, and that's a different subject, because obviously the government of Canada, and it's not, when you say Carney purchased bonds, it sounds like he did it personally. The
No,
government of Canada.
the
Yeah, good.
government. The
Yeah.
government
So
of Canada
yeah.
did when he come in as a strategy to deal with the tariffs when Trump started beaking off about them.
Well, which is an excellent idea. And being an international banker, he's probably aware that he who controls the bond market
Yeah.
and the U.S. debt has a huge hammer over the U.S. economy. The issue would then become, would the Americans ever renege on it and say, well, we're not honoring our bonds?
That's
But
happened before in history, I do believe. But
the
what I
thing
was
is, so
trying to point out was that Carney did make some very strategic financial moves against the U.S. that can be brought into negotiations at a later date to protect our financial position as a country in the negotiations of NAFTA. But the issue is, can we further build a strong defense against negotiations by these surtaxes? And you were talking earlier, you were talking about our oil and gas sector being one of the high demands that the U.S. wants. They've been
Yes.
getting since 1970s, when there was a world embargo on oil. We've been the backbone of supporting the American stability to access to oil and gas. It's now come to a head that Western provinces have been giving a discounted oil product to the refineries in Texas and the U.S. Is that something that we should look at as a country and put a surtax on all oil and natural gas products leaving the country? And I say yes, because that prevents provinces from lowballing the price that they're receiving, which affects our tax positions and our services that are offered to us through government. So I think that's something that should be addressed. And one way to address it is, you hear Polyev saying, I want pipelines approved now. Well, there's no pipelines being proposed by any private sector, U.S. foreign-owned companies. They don't want to ship natural gas to any LNG facilities because they have other LNG facilities in other countries that would lose their market share and profitability. So we're in a conundrum that we're behind on developing this because our industry is foreign owned and the money is controlled by foreign interests that have oil refineries and elsewhere in the world. So they would rather have our oil and gas supplies go to Texas, where they can upgrade it, do a big bump on it, and make huge profits off our discounted oil and natural gas. So when Polyev says, we need these pipelines, who's going to build them? And that's where the federal government has to come in and do like Alberta did in the 1950s. Alberta couldn't get their oil and gas out of the province to coastal waters, so they formed a crown corporation and were able to do that. And Canada needs to strategically build this infrastructure, and that has to come from federal government. Federal government has to step up and build these businesses that lower our taxes, because the profits from these businesses do cut your personal taxes. And every conservative government that comes into power always sells our crown corporations. Then our prices go up, our taxes go up because we don't have that revenue knocking our taxes down, and we don't have the infrastructure like Norway, which has a lot of crown corporations. So that's my rant on the oil, gas. Is there other areas that?
Yeah, I was talking about something totally different. I was talking about Canada being one of the largest investment sources for the U.S. Stocks, bonds, iPhone shares, Microsoft.
Your
Canadian
stock market.
Yeah, Canadian dollars are flowing down to the U.S. all the time from wealthy Canadians and wealth management people to buy U.S. stocks. Now, their object, of course, is to make as much money as possible for themselves. But we've so far only been talking about commodities, and commodities are what the most of us live on. When I go to the store and buy food, that's a commodity. My food prices will go up, but the commodity prices for the capitalist side of the coin, the ones that are buying stocks and bonds and IPOs down in the U.S., they're not getting hurt by any kind of tariff or tax whatsoever. And the fact of the matter is that the corporations in the U.S. want Canadian investment, or are angling for Canadian investment. They're slick at soliciting Canadian investment.
So you're trying to say we should tax every transaction of purchases on the New York stock market by Canadian investors?
Not necessarily tax it, but there should be some kind of currency controls so that there is a fee paid to make the investment a little more difficult, make Canadian and the investment in the Canadian financial sector a lot more, not profitable so much, but less challenging would be a better word. So they
So get priority on
keep the
Canadian
money.
investments in
Yes,
Canadian corporations
keep
versus
the money. Yeah, keep the money in
free
Canada.
transactions to buy foreign shares and
Now,
drop
now
foreign markets.
that could be done by way of a tax deduction as well as a tax increase. So if your funds are clipping blue chip stock like IBM, then your 25% tax rate goes up to at least what the average Canadian would pay on income that they earn the hard way, which is going to work every day.
Well,
So
I mean, we have a sales tax on every transaction of goods we buy. Why isn't there a sales transaction on every share you buy for a foreign company and a foreign investment? That should be the stepping stone to the stock market bringing in revenue to the federal government on transactions, because now we're doing millisecond transactions by computer trading, and the computer algorithms are one step back means two steps forward on the stock markets, because you're not seeing any rational economics in the valuation of prices of stocks. They just take one step back and two forward on these algorithms. You've mentioned before about the idea that there should be a sales tax on every transaction on the stock market and how much money that would bring to federal revenues. And I think that's probably one great way of retaliatory measures against the U.S., putting a Canadian sales tax on any Canadian buying stocks in foreign companies in the U.S. So that would be a very interesting one for Carney and the Liberal government to look at imposing. I bet a lot of wealthy people would see it as a wealth tax, but we do have wealth taxes. So this would be one that could generate a lot of revenue to Canada and also impose some eye-opening policy measures in the U.S. for foreign investments from Canadians.
the fear that people in politics have is twofold. One is that the majority of the funds that they raise to get elected come from people that can afford to give them funds, right? So naturally they're representing a wealthy class of people. The other fear that they have is that capital is mobile, that if Canada scares the capital out of Canada, it won't come back. But the reality is that Canada has the natural resources and it's got an educated workforce. So it's where's it going to flee to? To the U.S. where they have high tariffs? It's and the thing is, if you don't grab a piece of it while it is here, it'll definitely flee and you'll never see it come back. So
the other issue I wanted to bring up of talking about fleeing and flying, we have what's called snowbirds. And the snowbirds have notoriously been buying real estate in Florida, which is the home state of Trump. And that seems to be one of the most popular places for the wealthy. The less wealthy go to Vegas and Nevada and such. But what I wanted to point out is Canadians are spending a lot of money in real estate down in the U.S. And maybe we should be putting a sales tax on the purchases of buildings and assets in the U.S. that Canadian citizens do, so that we can deter the purchase of land and buildings in the U.S. by Canadians and try to keep them and their money in Canada more so.
I don't think that would work, because first of all, most of these people that are going down to Florida are buying condos and going down there for the winter. They don't want to freeze to death up here. So
winter's pretty warm. It's as far south as Northern California.
Where else are they going to go in the winter if they don't buy something in the U.S.? They'll buy it in Costa Rica or some other place.
Yeah, there you go. Maybe we should set up some special trade agreements with Costa Rica and warm countries where we encourage the purchase of assets in those countries versus buying houses in countries that are unstable like the U.S. under Trump. So
Well, we're
I
gonna.
think there are some options at the federal level to cut some trade deals for home purchases for the winter snowbirds in other countries. That's a great concept, I think.
Anyways, back to the reality of capital and how capital moves. The purchase of, you know, winter homes down in Florida isn't going to change anything, and if anything, it'll probably make the Americans cranky because they have to put up with Quebecers for the most part in most polite places in
Well,
Florida. A lot of Western Canadians go down to Arizona,
yeah,
you
that's
know,
true.
for the heat, you know. But the thing is, if you put a simple minor tax, it doesn't even have to be the full retail tax on the purchase and sale of shares. You know,
Yeah.
if I buy and sell a share 5 times in a day, how can I get to do that tax free?
Well, you're
And
rich. It's always
and
the wealthy get the benefits.
and if I give you a sort of an example, at one time in Vegas, your winnings were tax free, and Vegas
Yeah.
started to run out of money and water, so they decided that perhaps what they would do is tax over a certain amount of money, and I don't know what it is, $1,200 or something. So when you win 1,300 bucks on the slot machine, the machine stops, a gentleman shows up, takes the state's tax from the 1,300 bucks, and then lets you continue. Whereas in Canada, with respect to capital in the way of shares, we let you play with your shares up and down, backwards and sideways, tax free, until finally you decide to take them out. And when you
Right.
take them out, we tax them at a marginal tax rate of I think 25%, with a huge one-time capital tax free bonus.
Which
So
is
there's a
ridiculous because when you're working, a working class person pays anywhere from 30 to 50% of the money they earn and right off the top to the government. Why should these people with extra money that willing to gamble and on the stock market get their winnings tax free virtually compared to a working staff?
and again, that's lots of ways in which these tariffs can be compensated, because most of that money is going through U.S. companies. That would slow
Right.
down the purchase and sale of U.S. stocks and bonds, and it would encourage the investment not only in Canada but perhaps in Europe as well. So I think it's a place that we could look at as a country in order to try to stop the bleeding being caused by the Americans. What is it that they want is what we need to
Yeah, and
determine.
we need to set up stronger ties, which I think are going to be done with stable countries in Europe and stable countries in Africa, stable countries over in the Middle East, stable countries in Asia. That's where we have to focus and cut ties to this dependence on a radical, untrustworthy United States that would elect an alleged felon to run their country, and look at all the shit show that's going on down there. I don't think anybody in the world can trust the U.S., and yet 77 million people voted in Trump. So that tells you that the U.S. is unreliable. He's just the head of a bunch of people that will reelect somebody similar to him if he's ever removed from power there, which he may not want to give up that power anytime soon.
To give a quick example, a one-bedroom apartment in Toronto costs about $2,100 per month on average. A two-bedroom apartment is $2,700 a month. So you're looking at somebody in a one-bedroom apartment paying substantially more for a lot of products that can barely afford to rent an apartment. And the thing is, the tariffs are hitting the wrong level of our society. So we need to be careful about counter tariffs that we don't make it worse.
Yes, that's like Rob Ford in Ontario really wants to slap tariffs and countermeasures in place. and I think Carney's been slow playing it. But at what stage do you make sure that you have barriers and negotiation methods pre-planned for this NAFTA deal that's coming up? They're going to start negotiating that in about 6 months, and you're dealing with a moron Trump that really is untrustworthy, and you can't trust him to negotiate in good faith on anything. So I don't know what the best method, but there's some merits to Rob Ford's hit him hard, take our licks now, because we're going to get whipped under NAFTA anyway, so might as well cause as much ripple effect in both our own economy and the U.S. economy to force change. And that is
No,
one tactic, but
no,
I mean, we're all going to hurt because of it.
Rob Ford's not a rocket scientist, and
Well,
he likes to position himself as a tough guy. You know, his background is his family ran a store that put labels on coffee cups and ball caps. So you know, you can stand up and say, "Oh, I'm going to pound my chest and be a tough guy. I'm holding the grenade and I'm going to pull the pin and we're both going to die." That
right.
that is a horrible strategy in my opinion. But he knows that he has next to no say in what's going to happen in any event. So he can afford to make all these grandiose statements knowing that he has no authority to impose them. And I think it's bad for Canada that we have, 11, 12 mouthpieces, all saying different things to protect their regional businesses rather than having a central government being supported strongly so that it looks like at least Canada speaks with one voice instead of 20 or 30 different
Yeah,
ones.
well, you got Mega Smith here in Alberta and Mega Mo in Saskatchewan. They're all, Trump sees the division, and he's going to exploit it with all his media manipulation and propaganda. I do see a problem, and Carney's caught between a rock and a hard place. He does have to unify the message to the U.S., and we can either take our lumps now, or we are going to take our lumps in 6 months when Trump starts really exerting pressure on us. If we don't retaliate, he knows he's won. He can implement whatever he wants in NAFTA. If we retaliate and it hurts enough of the voters in the states, it can affect the way Trump wants to deal with us in the future. So you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you play softball, Trump sees it as a win. If you play hardball, Trump is known to cower because he just likes to be the bully on the block. So there is merits to Ford's strong tactics when you're dealing with a bully, and Ford would know those tactics probably better than anybody.
Well, he is a bully, but if we can get back to those tactics, it's in front of the courts now in the U.S. as to whether or not the president has the authority to put these tariffs in, and the more tariffs he puts in, the more it is obvious that he's exceeding his authority. So
yes,
at
but
some point,
we both know that these aren't tariffs; they're sanctions, and the U.S. president seems to have the ability to put sanctions as he sees fit. So if they challenge it under tariffs, they just go back to the court, say, no, 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 it's not tariffs, it's actually sanctions, and they're legal. So I can't see the courts having any merits. Trump is trying to undermine the legal system in the U.S. so that he can take over and be king for however long he lives and pass the reins to his family after he passes on or whatever. So I'm not sure what tariff issues the courts can actually prevent.
they can say that his entire sweeping tariffs are illegal. Now, what would that do? I would think that the people who have negotiated tariffs with him have already agreed to accept whatever it is that they were offered. So, in other words, Europe would be stuck with its 15%. Canada, on
That's
the
why
other
you don't
hand,
agree to it, because
yeah,
once
you
you
can't agree.
agree, you can't agree to anything. You let him impose it.
Yeah,
And then it's
and then
not
fight it.
binding on anything if their courts weigh whatever against Trump or for Trump. It's still, you're not in agreement.
Yeah. I think by the next midterms, though, hopefully half of the U.S. is sick and tired of this bullshit,
Well,
and dumps the son of a gun, right? You know, at
well,
least creates a counterbalance.
well, Trump keeps saying that the Democrats were able to rig the ballots and stuff. Well, the one thing he always says partial truths in his statements and blames and deflects to other people. So I'm thinking he might have some plan of influence the balance or being able to manipulate the ballots or the counts, because he doesn't seem to be afraid of voters at all. And Putin, with his hacks and ability on the internet, they may have something that we don't know about. And I can't see people voting for him in support. And if they did, I would really have to say there was some ballot ability to change the ballot somehow through the computer system. But that's just me. I mean, it's not a conspiracy theory. It's just when Trump says it, there's some partial truth to it, especially if he's deflecting to pointing that other people are going to be doing this, because that means he's already doing it usually.
So, anyways, we'll have to see where the tariffs go. But I think Canada needs to look at what they didn't tariff and put export.
So what's your what's your take? My take is hit them with everything we got. Get the pain over with now, because it's just going to happen 6 months to a year from now when we start negotiating NAFTA. Trump's going to slam the economy as hard as possible in Canada and the U.S. So I'm saying, be like Rob Ford, hit them with everything you got now. What's your position?
Wait them out.
Yeah.
Don't increase the cost of living to Canadians just to try to be retaliatory against Trump.
Okay, that's our take on it. I guess we will stop there. We'll see what works out and what Carney feels is the best method for Canada. Go, Carney, go. Okay, take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Subscribe to the channel, give us a like, and please share the video. Don't be afraid to share this commercial with your friends too.